Hi, I'm David Barr Kirtley, author of the book Save Me Please and Other Stories, and welcome to episode 613 of Geek's Guide to the Galaxy. Today on the show, we'll be discussing the first 11 stories from the book The Best of Kim Stanley Robinson. And the stories are Venice Drowned, Ridge Running, Before I Wake, Black Air, The Lucky Strike, A Sensitive Dependence on Initial Conditions, Arthur Sternbach Brings the Curveball to Mars, The Blind Geometer, Our Town, Escape from Kathmandu, and Remaking History. And this will include spoilers for all of those stories, so just be aware of that. And I'm joined today by my good friend Anthony Ha, making his 35th appearance on the show. His short fiction appears in Lady Churchill's Rosebud Wristlet, and in the chapbook Love Songs for Monsters. And his story A Brief History of the Afterlife recently appeared in the March-April issue of Asimov's magazine. He currently works as weekend editor at TechCrunch, and is a co-host of the podcast Original Content. And now here's our interview with Anthony Ha. All right, so we're here with Anthony Ha. Welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me back.
Okay, so tell us about your history reading Kim Stanley Robinson.
So in high school, I read the Mars trilogy. No, I read Mars. And I remember being impressed by it, but also like kind of bouncing off it a little bit, just because there's so much, fairly technical descriptions of terraforming Mars. And so for a long time, he was a writer I knew about, but hadn't really explored further. But in the last, I don't know, maybe decade or so, I've started to go a little bit deeper. I've read the full Mars trilogy, and after bouncing off of it so long ago, I think, it's one of the great series in science fiction. I've read The Ministry for the Future, which I think is less successful as fiction, but is certainly worth reading. And then I've read a decent amount of his, well, actually, that's not true. I'd read a handful of his short stories in various anthologies. And so I guess overall, like, he's somebody I've admired, but not necessarily had like a particularly deep relationship to.
Yeah, I'm also definitely not a Kim Stanley Robinson expert or anything. The first thing I read of his was his book, Escape from Kathmandu. This would have been when I was about 11. I just randomly came across it in the bookstore and I didn't know anything about him. I was just attracted by the cover where there's like Bigfoot wearing like a baseball cap and sunglasses. And I was like, oh, this looks funny. I like funny stuff. So, but I remember I thought it was pretty enjoyable at first, but I definitely lost interest at some point and never finished it. And then when I was a teenager, maybe around 15 or 16, I tried to read Red Mars. And I think I just read a chapter or two, and, it didn't seem that exciting. I mean, there's nothing wrong with it, but I just sort of put it down and never went back to it. And so then in 2012, through this podcast, I had a chance to interview Kim Stanley Robinson. And so at that time, I read his book, 2312. I read the first half of it because just given the schedule of the podcast, I didn't have time, because it's a huge book. I didn't have time to read the whole thing. But the half that I read, I thought was terrific. So that definitely made me interested to read more of his stuff. And just, because of the format of the podcast, it was, especially back then, it was rare that I would interview the same person more than once. So I just sort of watched as books like New York 2140 and especially Aurora came out that looked really cool, that I've always wanted to read, but just have never had the chance. Maybe someday, hopefully someday, I'll have a chance to read long novels like that again. But for the moment, I can only manage short stories. But I think Aurora is probably the number one book on my list that I want to read if if I ever have a chance to read a long science fiction novel with a baby.
I'm very curious about Aurora. I actually he was a guest at WisCon. I guess it was maybe a decade ago now, but he did a reading from Aurora at the time, and I remember that being just like really striking and dark. But yeah, I also never got around to reading the full book.
If people listening don't know, it's about an interstellar voyage. So kind of a hard science look at an interstellar voyage. So that definitely appeals to me. And just sort of from just what I gather, my impression is that he's the most important living science fiction writer. So that was kind of my impression going into these, and he deals, with really serious subjects like the environment and climate change and, economic alternatives to capitalism, these really kind of serious, interesting subjects. So that was kind of my impression of him going into this short story collection, was that, he's very likely the most important living science fiction writer, but also someone who, maybe his books aren't as entertaining as they could be. How does that impression strike you, Anthony?
I think that is fair for like a specific definition of important, in the sense that I don't know that I think he is certainly a very influential science fiction writer within the field. And certainly I think some of his books, like the Mars books, like The Ministry for the Future, have sold pretty well also. But that importance is partly about, his influence outside the field as well, that for people who are interested in climate change in particular, I think he's seen as, a very important thinker. And so in terms of like science fiction, outside of science fiction, I think he's probably arguably the most important.
Yeah, I mean, for just as research in the last day or two, I went and he did interviews like on Ezra Klein's podcast and on Chapo Trap House, these, these really, popular podcasts that I don't think interview a ton of science fiction writers. So I definitely agree with you that I have this impression that he has this profile outside of science fiction. But I also wanted to ask you, so you said over email, you said that with this book, The Best of Kim Stanley Robinson, that some of the stories you thought you would have a lot to say, and some of the stories you thought you would not have a lot to say. So I was wondering if you could just talk a little bit more about that.
Yeah, I mean, especially compared to the experience of reading The Best of Greg Egan, which we did last year, I felt like even in the cases of the Greg Egan stories that I didn't like, I felt like I still had some sort of response, and there were sort of things to chew on. Whereas with this collection, it felt like there were a lot of stories where I thought they were perfectly good stories, but didn't necessarily make a very strong impression on me, that they just felt like well-crafted stories that didn't necessarily, have me thinking or arguing with them much in the aftermath. And then there were maybe a handful of stories that, some of which I've read before, and so I was encountering them again, that I think then made a much stronger impression.
Yeah, and I guess I'll say the stories that we read for this episode were all from the 80s, I think, with maybe, I think there's one from 1990 and then one from 1999, but mostly all from the 80s, when Kim Stanley Robinson would have been roughly 28 years old to 38 years old. And around the time he was publishing his first novels as well. So this is very early in his career. And I watched an interview where he said, quote, "You don't want to read a novel that doesn't have a plot. I've had my butt whipped for trying that. It doesn't work." And so I think we're kind of going to be excavating, the period of his career when he was maybe being a little bit more experimental and trying, plotless stories and going through that learning process of discovering what works and what doesn't. So, but I agree with you. Yeah, there are definitely, stories in this batch that I have, I think, a lot to say about, and definitely a number that I don't have a lot to say about. And I feel like even Kim Stanley Robinson doesn't have a lot to say. If you read the author's notes, they're notably terse. And what's the word? A lot of the author's notes, he's just like, "Oh, I was in this country when I wrote this story," or, "I wrote this story for this anthology," or whatever. It doesn't go too deep into any characters or themes or, thought process or anything like that. So, I agree with you about that. Do you agree with my impression of those author's notes overall?
Yeah, I mean, I think that because this is a collection without kind of an overall introduction. So the only kind of non-fictional material is the author's notes at the end. So I think that puts more weight on them. And then also there are at least a handful of stories, both in the first and second half of the book, that I found also just kind of like mysterious or mystifying in some way. I was like, oh, I wonder what he was trying to do there. And the author's notes are generally no help at all. They're just like, this was nominated for a Nebula, and I went to the awards ceremony and I had a great time. You're like, okay, great.
Yeah. Yeah, I guess I'll mention too that Anthony got all excited and read the whole book. But I've only, we're only going to be talking about the first half today, so I've only read the first half, so I have no opinions at all about anything in the second half of the book. But I am looking forward to finishing up all the stories. But so let's get into the story. So the first story that we read for this is called Venice Drowned. And this is set sometime after the year 2040. And in this future, due to climate change, the city of Venice has mostly been covered with water. And there's just kind of like rooftops and clock towers and things poking up above the water. And so most people have abandoned the city, but you still have these, these remnants of people, who have little, live in like little shacks on top of the roofs. And the government has declared everything underwater to be kind of like fair game for salvage. And so there's this brisk tourist industry where tourists will come and go scuba diving and retrieve sort of cultural treasures from underneath the water. And so the main character is Carlo, and he is a tour guide who goes around in his boat leading tourists to the leading around the tourists who are interested in salvaging stuff from the drowned city of Venice. So Anthony, what did you think of Venice Drowned?
The first time I read it, I actually found it kind of overwhelming. I'm not sure exactly why, but it just felt like I think because at the beginning it's both introducing the character of Carlo, his profession, and then this sort of drowned setting, even though the title seems like a pretty strong clue that I should have been able to figure out what was going on. But I think, for some reason, the first time I read it, I was just like, where are we? Like, what's happening? I mean, I knew we were in Venice, but it was like, it was really hard to kind of understand the geography of these homes that are sort of like, I guess, usually kind of on the top floors of these buildings, and then the kind of flooded city around them, and then how his, family life and job kind of fits into all of that. And then I read it again, and I think it is like a pretty good story. There's a lot of really interesting elements into it. I didn't necessarily feel like that it sort of added up to something bigger. And maybe it's also because, at this point, Robinson is so associated with climate fiction that probably my expectations were also higher. And so to me, this was one of the, number of the stories in this collection where I'm like, that was fine, not amazing.
Yeah, I agree with you that the story is a little bit hard to visualize what's happening. It sort of assumes an immense amount of knowledge on the part of the reader of Venice geography, which I 100% do not possess. So references to things like Campaniles and the Lido and Serenissima, I have no idea. And I didn't really feel like putting the story down and looking them up. So I was just kind of doing my best. And I did sort of, stumble my way through and sort of figured everything out by the end. But I definitely feel like the story could have, held your hand a little bit more in terms of making the geography clear. And so what happens in the plot is that, so we've got this character Carlo, this tour guide, and he has these two Japanese tourists who want to retrieve this particular mosaic. It's called the Teotaka Madonna. And as they're in the process they sort of go scout it out, and he's just struck by the power of this work of art in a way he's never experienced before, and is sort of outraged at the thought of it being pillaged by these foreigners. And so he kind of has a meltdown and tells them that he's going home and he'll pick them up tomorrow. But then a big storm rolls in, and he ends up getting stuck in the storm and almost dies, and takes refuge in this kind of like tower where he meets a mysterious old woman who says cryptic things to him. So Anthony, what did you make of that sequence?
I found it quite cryptic. I mean, I think the first time I read it, because she says cryptic things to him, and then and then when he wakes up in the morning, she's gone, and it seems almost like there's sort of no trace of her that remains. But and to the point where I started wondering, oh, was she meant to be a ghost? Which, reading that section again several times, I don't think so. I think she's just a kind of, strange old woman who then wanders off early in the morning. But it has that feeling of, in another story, again, character kind of takes shelter in a storm and they encounter somebody, and then you find out, the next morning that that person was a ghost. That it has that healing to it, even though I don't think that we're actually meant to read it as something uncanny. But yeah, that whole segment I found like it was interesting to read, but I couldn't tell you, and maybe this contributed to that feeling of the story not fully adding up to something more, is I couldn't tell you exactly how it fits into into Carlo's arc.
Yeah, and when he first meets this woman, she thinks that he's the Grim Reaper, and she says like, "Oh, I wish you had been the Grim Reaper." So then when she's gone in the morning, my first thought was that she had, drowned herself in the night. But that's never really made explicit in any way, and I don't know if that's what Robinson intended. I did sort of Google around a little bit, and apparently some critics feel that this woman is like a like an embodiment of the spirit of Venice somehow, and there's a little bit, I guess, of a character arc where he, in the last moments of the story, he's feeling a little bit more positive about life, where he had been really kind of, fighting with his wife and unhappy at the beginning. So maybe there's something to that, but it didn't really come through very clearly to me exactly what Robinson was going for with this story.
Yeah, I mean, it did feel like a little bit of a precursor to one of the themes in the Mars novels where or not even a theme, but just sort of like it had the same kind of like emotional textures kind of towards the end of the Mars novels. I'll try to talk about this without spoilers, but like, there are characters who are for terraforming Mars and characters who are against it. And as sort of the terraforming proceeds, there's this feeling of, and he has this really, really beautiful writing about this sense of, even though there's all this loss, that you sort of keep living, and that a lot still endures. And that kind of was the kind of same tone that I felt in the end, where Carlo decides, okay, he's also wrestling, even though it doesn't end up being a big sort of seem like a big internal debate, but he's wrestling with this question of, am I going to continue helping these Japanese guys kind of deface these beautiful ruins under the water, and essentially decides, okay, it's, that's fine. Like, what matters about Venice is the living part of it, not these ruins. And to me, that felt like a nice emotional note to end on, even though it didn't feel like the story before it fully led up to it.
Yeah. So after this story, I'm like, okay, Robinson obviously knows a ton about Venice, or did a lot of research, and writes about the geography of Venice in a really detailed way. But maybe the plot of this was not fully working for me. Is that fair?
Yeah, and it's not that it's boring exactly. It's more that it just doesn't quite add up to any sort of significant emotional impact.
Yeah. Okay, well, let's move on to story number 2. This one is called Ridge Running. And so in this story, you have 3 like backpackers, Brian, Peter, and Joe. And this is a little confusing, honestly, but about halfway through the story, you find out that Joe had been in a very serious car accident, and they had, this is what the story says, quote, they stimulated what they called axonal sprouting in areas where neuronal connections were busted up, which means basically that they grew his brain back. And so as a result of this procedure, Joe kind of seems like he hallucinates a little bit, and he sort of speaks in a jumbled up way. And then there's this little subplot where they think they see a bighorn sheep, or I guess they see a bighorn sheep, but two of the characters go following after it, and then it kind of vanishes into thin air, seemingly. And that's kind of what happens in the story. So Anthony, what did you think of Ridge Running?
I guess similar to Venice Drowned, it was a story that had like very interesting parts, but didn't totally work for me as like I think it's ultimately like a reasonably successful but not amazing story. I think part of what I liked about it is again knowing, and this is one of the things that he does talk about in his afterword, is that this was him writing about actually going up into the mountains, which I know is like a big part of his life, one of his major passions. I think that also drives a lot of his interest in the environment and climate. And to me, that's actually the part of the story that feels most alive. Is just like there's a version of this story that is just a naturalistic story about three guys going on a hike together in the snow, and they've sort of drifted apart as often happens as you get older, but they just kind of keep going. And I think that to me is the interesting part of the story. The stuff about this guy, having been in an accident and they regrew his brain is an interesting idea, and they talk about it in some interesting ways. There's this whole question of, that one person says, all the thoughts are still there. They can't kind of come out with the right words, but it's still there. And then they debate, well, if he doesn't have the words, does he have the thoughts? Like, what does it mean to have thoughts without words? But it doesn't, it feels kind of underdeveloped, and that doesn't really feel like where the real excitement of the story is.
Yeah, and Kim Stanley Robinson definitely knows mountains and hiking. He published a nonfiction book called The High Sierra, and I haven't read it, but just the marketing materials for that mentioned that he's made more than 100 trips, more than 100 hiking trips into the Sierra Mountains. So, he definitely knows his stuff. There was one blurb I saw for it where it said, America's best nature writer also writes science fiction. Which I thought was funny, but he is a really good nature writer. And that comes through in this story. But again, the plot, I'm not quite sure what to make of it. Did you have any thoughts about what was going on with this bighorn sheep? Because it was almost, I don't know if it felt like it was presented as a mystery, sort of like in the previous story that this old woman was a mystery, but then the story never really gives you much to go on, to the extent where I'm not even sure is this just supposed to be a symbol or what.
I don't know. Yeah, I found that. I mean, I just felt like, in general, like a lot of it was sort of unclear in terms of like how much of this is imagined and how much of it is also just about sort of, trying to separate the three characters into different configurations. But this was also for me a story that just felt a little bit long for how little plot there was. And so as much as I sort of enjoyed the setting and the characters, I did find myself occasionally being like, wait, how many more pages left? Oh, wow, there's another 10 pages. Really? What's going to happen? And it turns out mostly to have been more of the same.
Yeah. And I definitely, as I alluded to at the beginning there, I definitely think we should have been clear on who these, how these characters know each other and what's going on with Joe earlier in the story. And also this conversation between Brian and Peter feels incredibly artificial. This is sort of writers sometimes call this, as you know, Bob, dialogue, where it's like there's no way that they're having a conversation about how this car accident has affected their friend for the first time, in the middle of this backpacking trip. So it's obviously for the benefit of the reader. So definitely some some craft issues with the story for me.
Yeah, and it has this slightly experimental feeling to it because, like you said, there's not a lot of clear exposition at the front. It kind of just puts you there. And I think he says something like 3 men sitting on a rock. And then there's like a recurrence of that phrase. Some of the language is really beautiful, but then it does again create some of these challenges like, wait, who are these 3 men? Why are they there? What's going on? And then necessitates some of these fairly clunky, really just that one big clunky conversation in the middle.
Yeah, I don't know if it was also just because I was coming out of Venice Drowned, but my initial impression was like, wait, is this like a post-apocalyptic story? These guys are all like hiking after the world's ended or something. I don't know. There was just something that gave me that vibe, and that turns out not to be true at all. But it just goes to show kind of how adrift I was at the beginning of the story, just sort of trying to sort out exactly what the situation was here.
Mm-hmm. I didn't have that trouble. Actually, I had a slightly different, I don't know if it's a problem, but it's a thing that happened to me with a number of the stories in this collection where which is often the case with a science fiction or fantasy story that's set in something that feels kind of like the present day, although I guess in this case it's not. But then you're waiting for, okay, what is the science fictional element? When the story doesn't tell you at the beginning, okay, we're in a secondary world or we're in the future, then you're like, okay, well, this is a science fiction story, right? So what's the science fiction part? And so there's also this thing of trying to orient myself because I'm like trying to keep an eye out for what is the futuristic thing or the uncanny thing. And often, including in this one, I feel like when you figure it out, that's the least interesting part of the story.
Yeah. Yeah. So, all right. So let's move on to the third story in the book. It's called Before I Wake. And so in this story, the Earth has passed into a region of outer space where there's some sort of strange electromagnetic influence, and it's caused everybody's brain to kind of go haywire so that people are constantly drifting in and out of a dream state. So they're kind of, they'll be awake and then dreaming and then awake and then dreaming, and they can't control it. And this is, worldwide. It's this worldwide, catastrophe. And so the main character is Fred Abernathy, and he's a scientist basically who is a little bit more resistant to this sleep than the average person, and is trying to, contrive some sort of technological solution to this predicament. So Anthony, what did you think of Before I Wake?
I really like this story. I think it's one of the ones I'd encountered before, and I think that when I read it first in another anthology, I did find it kind of hard to orient myself like these other stories, and then also because I think it was so different from what I expected from a Robinson story, and in a lot of ways it feels like him. He wrote his dissertation on Philip K. Dick. He's a PhD in English, and this also feels like even more than Philip K. Dick, it feels kind of like a J.G. Ballard story. And in some ways it uses the things that don't work as well in the previous stories to its advantage. Like that sense of disorientation, that sense of just where the hell am I is kind of what the whole story is about. And I think probably on first reading, it can still be kind of overwhelming. We're just like, what is, and this whole idea of, people kind of falling asleep and kind of constantly being on the edge between like waking and dreaming, and that boundary mattering less and less, I think is just inherently kind of surreal and disorienting and wrong footing to the reader. But I think if you can kind of get on its wavelength, I think it's actually a great story.
Yeah, I thought this was cool. I thought the premise was terrific. Definitely huge Philip K. Dick vibes. It was actually occurring to me that this was also kind of giving me the Lathe of Heaven vibes, the Ursula Le Guin novel that is actually like her homage to Philip K. Dick. So, her novel was written, very deliberately in the style of Philip K. Dick, using his themes and preoccupations and everything. And so I feel like Robinson here is maybe channeling both of them. Le Guin, I know from an interview I just listened to, was one of his teachers at UCSD when he was there. And he mentioned the Lathe of Heaven specifically. And also I'll just mention, I think this is obviously also influenced by a novel called Brainwave by Poul Anderson. And the premise is in that novel is that the Earth moves out of a region of electromagnetic fields or something, which has, for all of human history, suppressed human intellect. And so suddenly, human brains are able to operate at their full potential. So everybody gets this massive, intelligence boost in the story. So this is, kind of the opposite of that. But I think taking that same idea of the Earth moving through like weird regions that affect everybody on Earth. But yeah, I thought it was cool. And it's written in a very Philip K. Dick style where you have these sort of like, it's much more sort of straightforward. The language is much more straightforward and the character names are sort of more straightforward and bland. And, the world is very sort of, sketchy and generic. And so, yeah, it definitely just has that Philip K. Dick, feel to it. And I know you, Anthony, you taught a course on Philip K. Dick, a college course. So are there anything else? Do you agree with all of my observations there? Or is there anything else you want to say about the Philip K. Dick similarities?
No, I mean, I agree. And I think that, yeah, it's great that you mentioned The Lathe of Heaven, because I was just remembering, actually, I think we both read that for the Dreams in Science Fiction episode that you did. And obviously that's a big part of what this story is about too. I think what is similar is that just the sense of disorientation, which I think in Philip K. Dick's work is mostly intentional. And then once in a while you think, oh, did you just write this so quickly that it comes across that way? And this feels like it's very intentionally structured to just constantly, there's this repetition of this idea of then he woke up. But then you're like, where the hell are we? What's going on? And then sometimes when he thinks he's waking up, he hasn't waken up. And again, these are all things that happen in other fiction, but that's like really what the whole story is built from, moments like that. And I think the thing that, again, feels somewhat Philip K. Dick-esque, but especially kind of J.G. Ballard-esque, is this sense of these scientists working to try to reverse or push back against some kind of catastrophe, but there's a sense that it's futile, and that in this case it's even before we get to the end, that there's this because they're all so tired that it just becomes increasingly everything is just sort of falling apart in the lab. They're putting drops of acid on themselves to try to keep themselves awake. The whole thing just has this kind of nightmarish but also funny feel to it.
Yeah, for sure. Well, and they also, they're causing pain to keep themselves awake, but also taking amphetamines, which is another thing that kind of puts me in mind of Philip K. Dick. So I'll also mention and also the relationship, going back to The Lathe of Heaven for a second, the relationship between Fred Abernathy and his boss Winston kind of reminds me of the relationship between the dreamer and the therapist in The Lathe of Heaven. So yeah, I do definitely detect an influence there. So yeah, I thought this was really enjoyable. I mean, like a lot of Philip K. Dick stories, it's not the most beautifully written story or delves the deepest into human psychology or anything like that. But it's like a really sort of creepy and effective kind of nightmare story with I thought, a really cool premise. So yeah, I liked it.
Yeah, it's really a mood piece in a lot of ways, I think. And also, like a Philip K. Dick story, I think it ends kind of abruptly in a way that can maybe not feel great the first time you read it, but on subsequent readings, felt very right. Yeah.
So I liked it. Recommend it for sure. Okay, so let's move on to the next story, Black Air. So this story is set during the time of the defeat of the Spanish Armada, and the main character is Manuel, and he was press ganged. He was at a monastery or something and got press ganged into serving, in the Spanish Armada. And so obviously there's this big defeat, and there's all sorts of horrific, war things that happen, and then the ship ends up kind of drifting after the battle and having all sorts of other horrible things happen to it. Earlier in the story, he has some sort of, he falls ill and almost dies, and as a result of this near-death experience, he starts having these what may just be hallucinations, but in the context of the story are more probably like kind of glimpses into the other world, where he can kind of see people's souls in the form of like flames flickering around their heads and other kind of supernatural manifestations. So Anthony, what did you think of Black Air?
This was another one of the stories where I felt like I was reading it, trying to figure out what the genre element was going to be. And it ends up being, I mean, in retrospect, it's not all that subtle, but like you said, it's this thing where actually you could interpret the whole story as essentially taking place in our material reality, and he just is having these hallucinations. Although then there's a fantasy reading where he is, having all these visions, and they do suggest, tell him something about this other world and other people's souls and things like that. But again, I think similar to Ridge Running, it was a story where the genre stuff was less interesting to me, and just all the detail about this character kind of being forced to serve on this crew, and the other people he encounters, and the some of them like showing him kindness, but it can only go so far, and then just the absolute kind of brutality and death all around him. That was the stuff that I thought was really interesting, is the sort of straight historical narrative, and for that reason, I think maybe because I just think that setting and the character and the cast around him was so interesting that I ended up maybe liking the story more than the other kind of early stories, but it still did leave me a little bit with this feeling of like, like what exactly was he going for there, as much as I like enjoyed reading it and found so much of it interesting and memorable.
Yeah, I definitely think the plot probably could have been strengthened. But I enjoyed the story a lot more than those first two, for sure. So also what happens in the plot is that Manuel makes a friend who's this Irish shipmate. His name is Laeghr. I don't know how to pronounce that. Lair, something like that. Who on his deathbed teaches Manuel this Irish phrase. He just teaches it to him phonetically. He doesn't. Manuel doesn't even know what it means. But then at the end of the story, he ends up shipwrecked in Ireland and ends up speaking this phrase to the people he meets, and that ends up saving him. So that did sort of suggest a supernatural, reading to me, because I don't know. Otherwise, that's a pretty big coincidence that would have happened. Or, I don't know. I just prefer I prefer fantasy to be real, so I'm just going to choose to
well, and there's this, also this.
Yeah, go ahead.
There's an extra textual thing of, we know this is published in a science fiction magazine, so that predisposes you towards the fantasy reading.
Yeah, and I think it won a World Fantasy Award, so that is also pretty strong evidence for the fantasy reading. I was going to say, this one actually kind of reminds me, we were saying that the last story had very strong Philip K. Dick vibes. This one had very strong Tim Powers vibes to me. Just this combination of this really well realized historical setting with the sort of, weird dark magic and Catholicism and stuff. All definitely gave it a sort of Anubis Gates or On Stranger Tides kind of vibe to me. And they were both Tim Powers and Kim Stanley Robinson, I think, sort of, circulated around that Southern California scene that Philip K. Dick was in that orbit as well. So maybe there was some kind of cross influence, or or people were just all part of that sort of scene and all having influence, all being influenced together. Anthony, anything else you want to say on that?
No, I mean, the only thing is that makes me once again feel bad for not having read either The Anubis Gates or On Stranger Tides or anything novel length by Tim Powers. Like, if Tim Powers is like this story, then I definitely want to read some Tim Powers.
Yeah, no, definitely. If you like the story, you should read Tim Powers, and yeah, and just everybody should read The Anubis Gates, for sure. That's a terrific novel. And yeah, and Kim Stanley Robinson again obviously did a ton of research, or else just has a ton of knowledge about this time period. All the historical details felt totally believable to me. I guess I'll mention my favorite scene in this was where Manuel kind of gets summoned below decks, and there's sort of like different like floors of the ship that he makes his way down, each one like darker and more cramped than the last. And he makes his way into this little chamber at the bottom of the ship where, water has been leaking into it. So there's like a couple inches of water on the floor, and there's this like circle, like this, I don't know, circle, like this ritual going on with all these guys. And the room is lit with lamps, and otherwise it's, it's dark, but the light of the lamps is reflected in this water pooling on the floor. And they read like weird, I don't know, some sort of weird esoteric religious literature or something. And just that whole scene was really striking and creepy and memorable to me. I mean, yeah, like I said, overall, I think Manuel could have maybe just had more to do or more choices to make, or had a more active role or something. But overall, I liked the story just fine.
Yeah, my sense of him is that he comes off as sort of like almost like a holy fool kind of character. Like, not that he's dumb, but that he's sort of just kind of carried along by circumstance, protected by the supernatural or God or something, and never fully understanding kind of all these, bigger events that are happening around him until he, finally makes his way to safety.
Yeah, there was also the other thing I liked was that just this, I mean, I assume this is an accurate historical detail, but there's some sort of like bomb ship or something that's coming toward them, and they're all freaking out, and just the way the flames on this ship are described was really really colorful and memorable. So yeah, I mean, again, like Kim Stanley Robinson, he's just great on description, great on detail, like historical detail or geographical detail or whatever. And still, at least as far as this story, the plot is not fully working for me. But I'm definitely enjoying this story more than some of the earlier ones.
Yeah, and when you say he's great on detail, I do think that it's that he's able to like really visualize these environments, some of them real, some of them fantastical, and describe them in like very specific detail. I think sometimes, and I think this is true throughout his career, is that sometimes he's done so much research and so much imagining that I could probably use with a little bit less description, because it just gets a bit overwhelming. I don't know that I had a big problem with it in this story, but I do think that I'm always impressed with his description, but I am sometimes like bounce off it a little bit too.
Yeah, we'll get to that in a minute.
Okay.
But no, yeah, I'm just saying his description is always exquisitely well done. You can definitely have too much of a good thing. And even just like, I mean, I thought that reading, we only read about 200 pages, 220 pages or so for this, and I thought I would, breeze right through it. But you just open up some of these pages and it's just like this wall of text, just like, there's like no white space on the page at all. And that is, I like it. I like a little more white space on the page myself. Yeah. But there's nothing, there's nothing wrong with any of the description. It's really, exquisitely executed. But it does go a little bit overboard in terms of quantity sometimes. But we'll get to that in a second, or maybe in a couple minutes. But so the next story we're going to talk about is called The Lucky Strike. And so this is an alternate history story where the bomb crew that dropped the atomic bomb on Hiroshima dies in a training accident. And so the backup crew has to take over. And the bombardier in this backup crew is this guy, Captain Frank January. And he's a lot older than the other soldiers and more kind of sensitive, and has a lot more compunctions about dropping an atomic bomb on a city, and so he has to decide as they're flying toward the target what he's going to do. So Anthony, what did you think of The Lucky Strike?
So this was another story that I had read before. I think actually I read it when I was in college. And I think at the time I just was totally overwhelmed by this story and moved by it. And I mean, I think even when we were talking about doing this episode, that was the one I'd mentioned to you about like really loving. And so coming to it again, 20 years later, I think it's maybe would have been impossible for any story to fully live up to that version in my head, but it's still a very good story. I think it's like really, really powerful. And I think in particular, the thing that always sticks in my mind about it is there's a section of the story where, again, January was not expecting to be flying this run. And then suddenly he finds himself on board. And then he's just sort of thinking through like, can I get out of this? What is the right thing to do here? Can I just like find ways to sort of like drag my feet to get reassigned? Like what am I supposed to do here? And then ultimately kind of makes the decision to just slightly sabotage the bombing run so it doesn't land on a city. And I just think that passage where we're in January's head, even though I think in some ways you don't actually see him make that crucial decision, but you're just in that moment of panic and that sense of the weight of this decision that is kind of before him, that I think is just one of the most vivid descriptions of like moral choice that I can think of in fiction.
Yeah, I had never read this before. I thought this story was spectacular. I was really, really impressed by it. And I think that, in this case, Robinson's tendency to over describe or like, to slow the pace down really works to his advantage, because you have this like big thing that is coming, and just every page you're turning where you're not getting to it yet is just amping up the tension more and more and more and more. And you're like, oh my God, this guy is in such a horrible situation. Like, is he going to drop the bomb? That's horrible. But then is he going to like betray all his comrades and not do it and lie to them? And then like, that's horrible too. And it's just, I just had such a physical feeling of unease reading the story. I thought it was really, 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 really well done. And even just like closer to the beginning, there's a scene where they get this military briefing where they show the tests of the atomic bomb, and just the way that the room falls silent and this, sense of disquiet settles over the whole room. Like just everything about it I thought was so, so effective. So yeah, this is like by far my favorite story from the batch that we read. And I would definitely recommend everybody read it for sure. I have a couple quibbles maybe, but yeah, overall I was really, really impressed by this story.
Yeah. I mean, the funny thing is, of course, that I think Kim Stanley Robinson had some quibbles with at least the underlying argument of the story, which we'll get to very shortly. But yeah, no, I do think like on its own terms, it's pretty close to a perfect story. There are all these other like just really memorable scenes. Like the one I'm thinking of is when we see the Enola Gay, which was the plane that actually did drop the bomb in our timeline, goes for like a test run, and then like something goes wrong with the engine, and then it crashes and everyone dies. And it sort of is only slowly kind of dawning on you and on the characters what's happening, and the way that the mood of the scene where you think you're just sort of watching a kind of boring test run and this guy that January doesn't like kind of showing off. Then suddenly it like swerves into this like, kind of sudden shock of death. I thought was really effective. I think that, none of the other characters are sketched out, and are fully three-dimensional, but they have enough color that it feels real, that we understand, that we feel and particularly kind of the pressure when he's on the plane of like, he's surrounded by his crewmates and they all expect him to follow orders, and that kind of intense pressure he feels. And then afterwards, that sense of betrayal that comes from at least some of them when they begin to realize what he did, that he did it intentionally.
Yeah, and the story does go through all the arguments for and against dropping the bomb, and it sort of lays out all those arguments. So it does present this nuanced picture of that sort of ethical situation. I mean, I thought basically everything in the story was perfect, wouldn't change a thing up until like the last page or two. Where so what happens basically is that so January intentionally misses and then is court-martialed and sentenced to be executed by firing squad. And then this priest comes to kind of counsel him in his last hours. And the priest reveals that actually, because the bomb missed its target, that they were able to sort of, the U.S. government was able to sort of spin this as a demonstration, a warning, and that Japan surrendered anyway. And then we find out actually in the future there'll be this whole like January club that successfully lobbies for total nuclear disarmament. So because he made this choice, like, all nuclear weapons have been disarmed and, millions of lives have been saved. And it was just like, it was just straining my suspension of disbelief a little bit that it could be so positive. But I could maybe even get behind how positive it was. But it's just the fact that it's in this like long, tense story that it has just such an upbeat ending in like one page at the end. Felt a little, I don't know, too easy or too go ahead.
I think ultimately you're right. Although I think part of the reason that's there is also because that, like you said, it's this very long, tense story. And, and now you've seen somebody do what I think a lot of, certainly I felt like was ultimately the hard, right thing to do. And I think the story ultimately sides with him, and then he's going to be executed for it. And so there's also this real darkness to it. And so I think if you ended the story with him just going to the firing squad, that would be too dark. I think you could probably have gotten away with a version where it was just, he found out that, the Japanese were going to surrender, but then that whole future timeline is not spelled out. And that probably would have felt like a more honest ending.
Yeah, I mean, I think that would be the other choice is to, because if the Japanese surrender, I mean, that's like the right level of happy ending for me. Like if it also leads to total nuclear disarmament, that's where it's like, oh, come on, So, I think that would be the alternative I would consider. I mean, what I thought was going to happen was that the priest is lying to him about the Japanese surrendering. He's just telling him that to, kind of ease his passing in his final moments. But that didn't happen. But that is a thought that popped into my head. But I think that certainly if we're going to choose another ending, I think the ending of the Japanese surrender, but we don't get the total nuclear disarmament. I think that would have been the option B. I would seriously consider.
Yeah, no, that would. I mean, I think the priest lying. Yeah, it would really just change the whole valence of the ending, but it could be interesting too.
I guess I'll also mention, unfortunately, I didn't find this out until just this morning. But this story, The Lucky Strike, was published. PM Publishing has a series called Outspoken Authors, where they'll take some short story or two sometimes by a author, science fiction author who's particularly outspoken or controversial or whatever. And they have a whole series of these. But so they took The Lucky Strike and they packaged it up with kind of like interviews and ancillary materials and stuff like that. But so there's apparently an interview that Terry Bisson, who used to be the series editor, did with Kim Stanley Robinson that goes into more detail about his creative process and thought process and stuff. And so I wish I had a chance to read that before this episode. But if you're interested, I just want to give people a heads up that that's out there. And if you just want to read, what I thought was the best story in this batch without necessarily picking up the whole whole big hardcover. You could pick that up for $12 or something. Anthony, any other final thoughts on The Lucky Strike?
No, I mean, I think it's a great story. It is probably my favorite in this batch and in the whole collection. Spoiler for the next episode, with the exception perhaps of the very next story, which I think also is packaged included with The Lucky Strike. In that PM Press edition.
Yeah. So the next story, it's called A Sensitive Dependence on Initial Conditions. So this was 6 years later, after The Lucky Strike. And so Robinson, I guess, maybe shared some of my thoughts about the last page and sort of had second thoughts about it, maybe being too like overly cheerful or something. And so in this is it almost reads like an author's afterword or something. It's sort of presented as fiction, but it's definitely not a traditional narrative. But it sort of goes through different models that historians, I guess, have used or political theorists have used just to try to, explain history or, quantify history. And it sort of explains those models mixed in with discussions of different ways, different like alternate history scenarios that could have unfolded as a result of Frank January's decision not to drop the atomic bomb in the story, The Lucky Strike. So, in the story as it's published, it's the super happy ending, but then there's like all sorts of more, mixed scenarios or outright way worse scenarios that are all kind of in the mix in this follow-up story. So I guess I'll stop there. So Anthony, what was your overall reaction to A Sensitive Dependence on Initial Conditions?
I think my reaction to it also maybe was colored by expectations in the same way that maybe I'd gone into The Lucky Strike with super high expectations from my own memory. I had heard about sensitive dependence on initial conditions in the sense of just, it's, Kim Stanley Robinson kind of having second thoughts about that flash forward, and then sort of explicating why maybe that's a little too easy. But I was like, well, what's the story? I don't know. That doesn't really sound like a short story. That sounds like an author's afterword. And like you said, in some ways that is essentially what it is. There's no narrative in a traditional sense, but it actually, for me, reading it right after The Lucky Strike, it did have that, it still felt like really engaging and powerful and pretty just sort of emotionally engaging. And it felt like it kind of amplified the argument of The Lucky Strike in really interesting ways. And that essentially the way I made sense of it was that in The Lucky Strike, it says, he has to make this very, very difficult, impossibly difficult decision. He decides not to drop the bomb on Hiroshima. And then the story says, let me tell you, that was the right decision. And this is why. And then this whole story about maybe it wasn't the right decision. Maybe we don't know. And here are all these different things that could have happened. And then the way it ends, it says, you are flying towards Hiroshima. Like this idea that, that you are still, that you don't know what the outcome is going to be. There are all these different ways you can model the outcomes. And still you have to make this choice. And you have to make the choice without the help of a happy ending, without the guarantee of a happy ending, but you still have to make the choice. To me, that was like a very powerful thing. Even though, again, it's not really a story. It's just like these kind of scenarios and vignettes. I think I was also just very impressed that he pulled it off, that it didn't feel like a dry textbook, but that something about the language and the succession of scenes and scenarios felt like it had this cumulative power.
Maybe I'll need to come back and read this in a couple of years, and I'll like it more. It was kind of giving me flashbacks to, I studied political science in college. And I would, sit through these lectures where, they would say, here's all these models for understanding history. There's the great man theory, and there's the Marxist theory. And it always just kind of drove me. I mean, I was just like, this is a complete waste of time. You cannot abstract out anything meaningful from history that would give you any predictive power whatsoever. And I feel like that intuition of mine has been completely borne out. I don't know if you know the work of Philip Tetlock, but he's he's done kind of the most research into predicting world events and stuff like that. And the outcome of his research is basically that experts do almost no better than chance at predicting future events. And the experts who do the worst at predicting future events are ones who have some like grand unified theory of how the world works, like the great man theory or the Marxist theory or something. And that the people who do the best just look at specific situations and, update their understanding based on feedback, information feedback as much as possible. But so I had a little bit of a negative response to all the discussions of the, he talks about, these are the ones he mentions, like the covering law model, the sufficient conditions model, the necessary conditions model, the weak covering law model, strong covering law model. I don't really remember a lot about those if I ever learned, but I suspect they're all total nonsense and not useful at all for predicting the future. But I did think actually that the piece was interesting in its, in how it sort of subverts or, expresses qualms about Robinson's earlier story. I thought actually the most interesting thing in it was this was new to me, the Lyapunov exponent. I guess this comes out of chaos theory, but the idea is that basically if the future might either branch into wider and wider possibilities so that even the smallest thing you do can change everything, or it might converge, so that like, the South wins the Civil War, but, over 100 years or 200 years or 300 years, it doesn't make that much difference. There's sort of this, what would you call it? Inertia to history. And, I think we definitely, I definitely find the first, the scenario where history branches unpredictably more plausible, but it was interesting to me that the story touched on those two ideas. But I don't know, Anthony, do you have any reaction to anything I'm talking about here?
Yeah, I mean, as maybe a little bit of a digression, I mean, I think I don't think I know Tetlock's work, or I can't off the top of my head recall it, but I think I've seen similar things. I mean, particularly,
I think he has a book. I think it's called Super Forecasting. That's sort of the best known.
I think I've seen discussions also around sort of, predicting like presidential elections, right? I think is often the most common example people use. And I do think that there is value to historical models beyond their predictive value. I think that it's also about, just sort of making sense of how we got here. And so even if they're not, value, if they don't have this sort of utility in like telling you what's going to happen next, they could potentially still have value. But that's it. Certainly, yeah, it's funny because,
but they help you get things straight in your head, if nothing else. Right?
Yes,
what you're saying.
Yes, and right. Or if you say something like if you want to understand, say like World War II or the New Deal or the Civil Rights Movement and sort of why did things happen the way they did, ultimately you have to have some sort of like model or not, maybe not a grand unified model, right? And I do think part of the story is maybe almost undermining those models, or by cycling through them so quickly, kind of suggesting that none of them is ultimately sufficient. But that you do need some sense of like some way to, again, when you talk about things about like great man theory, did the civil rights movement succeed because was it because, Lyndon Johnson was president and he was a great legislator, or was it because of all of the, grassroots activism that came before? And not to say that there's one correct theory, but I think there's value in those sorts of debates and those attempts to understand our past. And again, I said that as, somebody who really has no academic background in that at all. But I think in terms of the story, it's weird because I don't think, without opening the book again, I couldn't describe any of the theories that he talks about off the top of my head. It was more about that cumulative effect and the different scenarios and the feeling of, of uncertainty that I think the weird thing about this story, as much as I like it and am impressed with it, is that I think it doesn't. I mean, it's probably comprehensible if you haven't read The Lucky Strike, but it also probably has
I can't imagine someone reading this without having read The Lucky Strike and having any idea what's going on at all.
Because you just be like, why are there all these
Frank
examples
January is a totally fictional character. Like, how would you? I don't know.
It's this weird thing that I think it's essentially nothing without The Lucky Strike. But reading it right after The Lucky Strike, I think it has this emotional force that, because it felt like you talked about at the end of The Lucky Strike, there's this sort of artificial happiness, and that so much of The Lucky Strike is about this feeling of uncertainty, and then at the end they give you the certainty, and then this story almost takes that certainty away again in a way that I found really powerful, and that it was less about, even though it is in some ways like maybe one of the purest forms of idea fiction I can think of, it also is, again, I felt it was also making this argument essentially that like, like even if you don't know what the outcome is going to be, like, could this potentially lead to more nuclear armament, to nuclear war? Quite possibly, but you still probably should decide not to bomb a city full of people.
Well, I mean, that's the thing I was not sure about, is because, I mean, the Lucky Strike, the original story seems to be arguing very clearly that, it's important for individuals to obey their ethical imperatives because, look at what a big difference one person's choices can make to the world, etc. And then with a sensitive dependence on initial conditions, I'm not actually sure what we're meant to take away from it. I mean, it's like, it seems to me it's maybe making the argument that, it seems to be making the argument you never know. Like, nobody ever knows what's going to happen in the future. Like, any choice you make could lead to, a completely unpredictable, set of outcomes. And I'm not sure what, I mean, that's definitely true, I think. I mean, we kind of, well, I don't know. It's not totally, there's some correlation, I'm sure, between, what you try to accomplish and what you end up accomplishing. But I'm not sure in terms of how do I act, exactly what I'm meant to take away from the second story.
I think it's not necessarily giving a clear answer, but I think, and I think this is probably partly my own baggage of like bringing to it. I think a lot of contemporary debates about sort of like, what is the pragmatic thing to do? What is the principled thing to do in terms of, a lot of really bad things happening in U.S. politics right now. And so I interpreted it, and again, I think there's probably other ways you could read it, but I interpreted it as that it's a continued argument for principle, but from the idea that, that essentially because outcomes are so unpredictable that like, you can't do the right thing and know that it's going to have the outcome that you want. You just have to do the right thing anyway and then see what happens.
Mm. Yeah, I feel like this is a pair of stories we could probably talk about for a long, long time. But we have a couple more stories we have to... Oh boy, we actually have a bunch more.
Okay,
we have 5 more stories. So we'll
make it fast.
But yeah, so
but see, I was right. There's a handful of stories that we could go like a full hour on, and others are like, yeah, it was okay, it wasn't great.
Yeah, well, that brings us to our next story. Arthur Sternbach brings the curveball to Mars. So in this story, it's there's a colony on Mars, and they, the people living on Mars have decided they want to take up baseball. But none of them have any experience with playing baseball. It's just something like, that they've heard about. And so our main character is Arthur, and he's from Earth. So he grew up playing baseball. So he knows a lot more about baseball than these Martians. And he befriends another player on his team named Gregor, who's native to Mars, and teaches him how to throw a curveball. which enables Gregor to, dominate the other Martians at baseball. So, Anthony, what did you think of this story?
It was a story that I really liked. It's one of the ones that like I'm not sure there's like a lot to chew on or argue over the way it was with the last two, but sort of on its own terms as just a fun baseball story. I really enjoyed it. I mean, I should say I'm not somebody who, I've been to some baseball games. I've enjoyed them. I don't really follow baseball. I think the most interesting thing to me about baseball is how many writers seem fascinated by baseball and how it's seems to be such a literary sport in some ways. And then, of course, this is, I believe, along with another later story in the collection, Sexual Dimorphism, is set in the Mars of the Mars trilogy. And so I think one of the advantages of that is that he has this sort of incredibly rich setting that he can just plug a smaller story in, and he doesn't have to sort of build a whole universe from scratch. And I do think there's kind of a richness to the background that doesn't have to really get into, but makes it, feel like a real place.
Yeah, I definitely thought my favorite part of the story was definitely just the description of what it would be like to play baseball on Mars, and because the gravity is so much less, and because the horizon seems so much closer. He describes how the outfield has to be so big that it seems to stretch practically to the horizon, and all that stuff I thought was really cool. I definitely thought there should have been more of a plot in this one. It was basically like, if I just tell you it's a story about some guys playing baseball on Mars, like that's basically has covered 100% of what happens in the story. Like there's no like, twists or revelations or, reversals really or anything. It's, they just have fun playing baseball basically. So yeah, it's a little light on drama. I didn't mind it, but yeah, I would have preferred some sort of more traditional plot structure myself. The one thing that
there is a plot structure. It's just a very low stakes plot structure. The plot is just how well is this team going to do in baseball?
Okay, but who cares? Well, I don't know. I don't watch baseball, so I don't care. Right. I don't care in real life. I don't care in this fictional story either.
So like you're saying, it's low stakes. And maybe the lowest stakes for you.
Yeah. So the part that kind of caught my interest was, so there's a scene where Arthur goes to Gregor's house and meets his family, and Arthur says, wait, I thought I wrote it down. Oh, it's okay. So the story says, next time I was at practice, I said to Gregor, were those your grandparents? And Gregor responds, yeah, like my grandparents. And Arthur says, and that girl, who was she? No answer. Like a cousin or something? Yes. Gregor, what about your parents? Where are they? He just shrugged and started throwing me the ball. So this to me was a lot like the woman, the old woman in Venice Drowned, or like the mountain goats or whatever in Ridge Running, where I felt like it was like presenting something as a mystery, and then the mystery never got answered. I don't know if you've read the other material set in this universe, if that sheds any light on it or not, but it did strike me as odd that conversation was never returned to in this story.
Yeah, I guess it reminded me of those elements in the stories also in the sense that as soon as you started talking about them, I was like, oh God, Dave's going to ask me what happened, and I don't know, which is true. I think Gregor is supposed to be this mysterious character who is sort of very taciturn and just has this sort of preternatural skill with baseball. But in terms of so who are those people? Who is the woman? I don't know. It does create that sense of mystery around him, but maybe there is a more literal interpretation that a smarter reader could figure out.
I can only surmise, not having read any of the other material in this universe, but I did listen to an interview where I heard Kim Stanley Robinson talking about how kind of like found family is one of his themes, or like alternative family arrangements or configurations or something like that. So it does make me wonder if Gregor's like literal biological family has died in an accident or got left behind on Earth or something, and this is his, found family, and he just doesn't want to talk about that because it would just bring up some tragedy in his past or something like that. That's my best surmise, but I'm really not sure.
Yeah, I mean, in the Robinson that I read, it's less that there's sort of like new family units in the sense of like, oh, you've been orphaned or something like that and need to find new parents, but more in the sense of characters forming kind of like really deep bonds outside the family, or I guess particularly in the Mars books, that there's like a set of characters who through these sort of medical treatments are live for centuries, and so they develop these kind of very complex family. They become this like weird kind of not quite immortal but sort of immortal family. But yeah, I don't remember. Again, it's been a while since I've read the Mars books. So I don't remember a specific explanation that would be relevant here.
I think maybe it was in 2312. I think he has like groups of people who raise kids together and stuff like that. So I don't know. Maybe it's somehow related to that idea. I'm not sure.
Yeah,
I didn't mean to put you on the spot there.
No, it's good. That's what I'm here for. I can own it, not knowing. But I did really like also the texture of that sense of how a lot of people on Mars are sort of just there for a little while. And, he's come for a specific assignment. He's going to play on this team and he's making these relationships, but he also knows that he's going to go back to Earth at a certain point. And again, I think that's something that they don't get into as much in the books because the books are focused on these characters who were on Mars for centuries. But the idea that, I live in New York City, you used to live in New York City, that there was this sense of also like people would come, people would go. Sometimes you'd have these relationships that are probably only going to last for a couple of years. And it's not like a particularly deep thing, but I did feel like that added some nice texture to it.
Yeah, and I definitely experienced that growing up in the New York area. It was sort of like this rotating cast of friends who came and went. Because it's such an expensive place, people don't stay unless they have some really compelling reason to be there. All right, but let's get into our next story, which is called "The Blind Geometer." And so in this story, it's in the future. I forget the year, not super far in the future, but sort of near future relatively. And there's a genius mathematician named Carlos. He's also blind. He's the blind geometer of the title. And he has a scummy colleague named Jeremy. And Jeremy works for the Pentagon, allegedly, and is always kind of trying to pump Carlos for information because Carlos is a superior scientist to him. And Carlos, tries to remain cordial with him, but doesn't fully cooperate. And so one day, Jeremy comes to Carlos and says, "Can you interpret this diagram, this sort of mathematical diagram?" And it comes out eventually that this diagram has allegedly been drawn by a woman, by an astronomer, I think, who was at a lab and all her colleagues mysteriously vanished. And now she just kind of like speaks in this jumbled up, out of sequence way. And this mathematical diagram is somehow the key to understanding what her experience has been. So Anthony, what did you think of The Blind Geometer?
This is a story that when I read it, I found it very absorbing. I mean, the kind of espionage plot, the mystery of who this woman is, and sort of the layers of secrets, and then also just kind of realizing kind of how evil the organization that's trying to like blackmail the protagonist into cooperating is. Like, they were like all really compelling when I was reading the story. And yet now that there's been a little distance, like this story made maybe the least impression on me of any of the stories. Like, it was like just super fast, absorbing, interesting plot, and then just kind of disappeared from my mind. Like it was interesting, but kind of didn't there were kind of no ideas for me that I felt like I could really hold on to.
Yeah, well, it's fairly complicated. There's a lot going on. There's a lot of subplots and stuff. And then also what you think, for like 80% of the story or so, you think something is going on involving this like disappearing scientists and so on. And then you kind of have the rug pulled out from under you. And it turns out something completely different was going on. But that's explained very quickly. So I could definitely see how you might be vague on the details. I mean, I was, until I sort of had to review what happened before we sat down to record here. But yeah, I was really into this story for like 80% of it. And then I felt like it kind of I ended up enjoying it just fine overall, but it definitely kind of went off the rails a little bit for me around the time that Carlos has sex with Mary, the woman who did the diagram. Like, not that there's anything wrong with that. That was just around the point that, because then like, there's all this interesting stuff where he knows he's being spied on, but he doesn't know what. And like, she seems like she's maybe an ally, but then she also seems like she's hiding stuff. And so it turns out what the explanation is basically is that this whole thing involving the disappearing scientists was a mirage. It never happened. And actually, Mary has been like programmed with mind control drugs to try to appeal to his sympathies and get this information out of him that Jeremy has been unable to get out any other way. And Jeremy is not actually working for the Pentagon. He's actually working for some evil corporation, which is trying to develop some sort of like particle beam weapon or something. So all that was fine, but it was actually way less interesting to me than where it seemed like the story was going from the start. So I feel like you're always in a bit of trouble when the twist ends up being less interesting than you kind of were expecting it to be.
Well, and it essentially just makes it a much more kind of mundane story, that there's not a big mystery to be figured out. It's just these people it's an evil corporation, which is, certainly a very reliable plot device. But like, there's not, again, just this feeling that there's kind of not a lot to it.
Yeah, there was also this thing I didn't like where like, he thinks he's being spied on by the Pentagon basically, and he puts like a mouse trap in his file drawer so that if they reach into the file drawer, the mouse trap will close on their fingers, and it's just kind of like a fuck you to the Pentagon. And then when he realizes it's actually a evil corporation who's going to kill him, he's like, shit, why did I do that? That was dumb. And I thought it was kind of like dumb to begin with. So the fact that all this toing and froing at the end of the story hinges on this kind of like dumb, nonsensical thing with the mousetrap was also a bit of an issue for me. But I mean, perfectly enjoyable story overall. But I was definitely more invested in the disappearing scientists and like the weird diagram. Like, what is the meaning of this weird diagram, which turns out to also to have like some really like mundane explanation. So yeah, sort of a mixed bag of the story. From you actually, I'll mention you, Anthony. You mentioned Greg Egan earlier, and this story was giving me massive Greg Egan vibes. Like, if you had slipped this in with the Greg Egan stories, I would have not have detected, I don't think, anything amiss. It's got all of his trademark mathematicians and evil corporations and kind of arrogant, coldly detached. Actually, I'll say the narrator I thought was really, really good in this. The story spends a lot of time characterizing him, and I thought he was really a really interesting, well-drawn character. I enjoyed spending time with him and being in his kind of like arrogant, persnickety, meticulous sort of consciousness.
Yeah, but I think that was by far the best thing about the story. I mean, I think it does also it moves. There's, even if you sort of don't accept all the twists, there's sort of enough development in the plot that it just always has this momentum. And so I was never bored with it. And yeah, definitely the main takeaway was the narrator himself.
Mm-hmm. I do think like the mind control drugs thing could have maybe been set up better, because I think there's like a throwaway line, or what seems like a throwaway line about like, oh, drugs can do amazing things these days. And it seems like a lot in the story hinged on that without really being properly set up.
I think if it was a Greg Egan story, the kind of math part of it would have paid off a lot more, though. I mean, maybe we would have understood it or not, but I don't think we would. I would not. I
wouldn't have.
Yeah.
Yeah. Maybe Kim Stanley Robinson should have collaborated with Greg Egan on the story. They could have brought something to it. All right, so let's move on to Our Town. So in this story, it's in the future, and the elites live in these, big towers, while the poor, live in desperate squalor down on Earth. And the elites, the decadent elites, spend their days throwing art shows where they have these, human clones who are, I think they have like adult bodies, but maybe like the minds of children, or, at least not fully developed human brains. But they take these clones and kind of like freeze them somehow with force fields into sculptures. So you have these sculptures of these clones frozen in place. And sometimes we gather they're not very nice to the clones. So there's this sort of, sadistic aspect to seeing these, the tortured expressions on the faces of the frozen clones. So that's basically the setup. So Anthony, what did you think of Our Town?
I thought it was an interesting setup, but there wasn't really much of a story to it, and everything kind of just felt very compressed and rushed and abrupt. And I don't know, maybe the setting itself is just such a kind of exaggerated setting that you couldn't write a longer piece in it. But yeah, I mean, I think it's the shortest story in this first batch, and one of the shortest stories in the whole collection. And it just, it did not feel like it had enough space to really do anything interesting or memorable.
Yeah, totally agree. Yeah, it was too short. And also, I mean, this was published in 1986, so maybe in 1986, there wasn't quite so much dystopian, everything everywhere. But I mean, in the like sea of dystopian stories that we're swimming in now, this doesn't really stand out particularly. I did think that idea of freezing the clones to create sculptures I thought was really cool. But that was pretty much the only thing that really struck me about the story. This one seemed a lot to me in retrospect. I mean, it precedes it, but it struck me a lot in retrospect as like a Paolo Bacigalupi story. But I think if you at this point, you could just read Paolo Bacigalupi, you could just read, The Fluted Girl and, stories like that. And, I think it takes this sort of, this sort of setting and just develops it, a lot more thoroughly.
Yeah, literally just by having a story that might be like 2 or 3 or 4 times longer, I feel like you would have more there.
Yeah, and nothing's really going on with the characters. You have the narrator and this woman Cleo, who are just total dicks. There's no gradations to their personalities at all. And then you have this sort of rebel guy, Desmond Keene, who also is just very sort of one dimensional in the story. So yeah, just needs more development, in my opinion.
Yeah.
Okay. Escape from Kathmandu. It's all coming back to the beginning. Okay. So actually the book Escape from Kathmandu I read, or I guess didn't read, started, consists, I gather now, of 4 novellas, about the same characters, these hikers in Nepal and possibly surrounding regions. And so what was included in the best of Kim Stanley Robinson was the first of these novellas. Okay, and so in this story, you have... Okay, well, it has a great first line, I'll say off the bat. The first line is, usually I'm not much interested in other people's mail. And so you have this guy, George, and he's at a hotel in Kathmandu, and there's all this like mail that nobody ever looks at, or that it has presumably missed its intended recipient. And so one day he's just bored. He's like, I'm just going to open one of these, the most interesting looking of these packages, and see what's in it, because no one's ever going to, no one's ever going to come to collect it. And so what's inside is a letter from Nathan, another kind of backpacker guy, describing how he went along on an expedition up into the Himalayas and encountered a Yeti, and how he lied and said he hadn't seen the Yeti, but now some of the other people he went with, I guess one of the other people he went with did see the Yeti too, and so they're going to try to go capture the Yeti and use it for publicity and stuff like that. And Nathan thinks that that's wrong, so he is determined to rescue the Yeti and return it to its natural habitat. And so George gets himself wrapped up in this situation to try to help the Yeti escape from Kathmandu. So, Anthony, what did you think of this story?
I loved it. I think that, I think there are certain ideas that maybe are worth talking about in terms of like how they fit into, the ways Robinson talks about science and things like that. But like fundamentally, this is just such a fun story. And I mean, even hearing you describe the setup of the story was reminding me how there's so much that from like a conventional writing perspective, that beginning is so needless. And just having this whole extra character who like has no real relationship to the core plot, but just is like, well, I stole your mail and now I'm involved in this attempt to rescue this Yeti. Feels like something that like, in a writing class, you'd be like, why do you have this other person? You got to take them out. But in the story, it's all just like so delightful. And like, it's definitely for me, like the most purely delightful story in the collection, I think, or certainly in the first half. And it's just like full of like all this vivid detail about being like an expatriate in Kathmandu, and and then like the there's all these like kind of, I mean, it's also like probably the only like really, except for maybe Arthur Sternbach, it's probably the only kind of like really comic story. But yeah, it was just such a pure pleasure to read.
Yeah, I mean, I really liked all the stuff I described so far. I really loved. The like George opening the mail and reading the whole story about Nathan finding the Yeti and everything. I thought all that stuff was terrific. I did not like the rest of the story as much as that.
Oh, interesting.
Initial section, and I could kind of. I think I as a kid I gave up sort of midway through this one. I don't think I even made it to the second novella. And I could kind of see, like rereading it, I felt like I could kind of see why. I don't want to like harsh your buzz or anything here.
No, it's okay. I want to hear it. And then,
well, yeah. So I mean, I think just like the expression "brevity is the soul of wit." I just felt like this is a story about getting a Yeti out of Kathmandu, and it's like 48 pages long. It's really, really long. And Robinson goes into enormous detail about what Kathmandu is like and what it's like traveling around the region and everything. And it's all fantastic. Like all that material is fantastic. But I felt like the story was a little bit of an awkward collision of a goofy rescuing the Yeti story, which by its nature should be short, and a very, very detailed travelogue about Kathmandu, which I felt like just disrupted the pacing too much for me. And I felt like this could have, I would be perfectly happy with a 25-page rescuing the Yeti story. An almost 50-page rescuing the Yeti story was just a little bit too much rescuing the Yeti for me. But what do you think about that?
That's interesting. I mean, I do think that, that I was thinking about that saying, brevity is the soul of wit. And I mean, obviously I think that can be true, but I do think that some of the most enjoyable sort of comic and humorous novels can be, like can be about sort of like the style and voice, which can actually be not concise at all, but can be like really humorously long-winded or digressive. And I think there's a lot of that here. I think also that there's a certain like I could imagine that, yeah, maybe there's a version of this that's like 10-page shorter with like less description. Although that stuff didn't bother me too much, but I could see the argument that it's really not that necessary. And maybe if you're not enjoying it as much as I am, that then it really kind of dilutes your enjoyment of the funny parts. But I think it does need a certain amount of length because part of the structure is this sort of pile up of like ridiculous coincidences, both to try to get him out, and then like just like, I mean, I guess the thing I'm really thinking about is like when like Jimmy Carter shows up and I think if this is like a very short story and Jimmy Carter shows up on page 6, that has a very different effect than when like you've been reading this story for whatever 25 or 30 pages and suddenly the Carters show up and then they're trying to like, there's something about the length and the fact that there are so many developments and so many obstacles to their getting out that to me is part of the pleasure, even if I think that certainly from like an economy, there's nothing about this story that's economical. It's all about sort of like excess in storytelling.
Yeah, and Robinson says in his author's note that he did run into Jimmy Carter on his travels somewhere, so that's kind of what inspired that. I guess so. Okay, so if you don't buy the pacing thing, I'll go into all my other problems with the story.
Sure. Okay.
So we start off with George, the narrator, and he reads Nathan's very long account of meeting the Yeti, which again I said is terrific. And then George, in like 4 or 5 pages, is like, "Hey Nathan, I'm here to help you rescue the Yeti." And at this point, we know a lot about Nathan, and we know basically nothing about George or why he would care that much about rescuing the Yeti or like what his emotional investment is at all. And we never really get a whole lot more on that either. I mean, you said like you would think, in a writing class they would tell you like, why do you even need this character? Get rid of him, and yeah, I'm the person in the writing class who would be telling you that. And then also, I mean, like just given the tone of the story, it's basically a foregone conclusion that they're going to succeed in getting the Yeti out of Kathmandu. And so then, there's like 30 pages or so where you're just kind of like waiting for the inevitable, like I know it's going to happen. And there's not really there's no mysteries, there's no, suspense really, because I basically know what's going to happen. There's not really any conflict among the heroes. The heroes are all sort of blandly agreeable, basically. The Yeti is super chill. So there's just like a lack of conflict and drama to my mind for a story that's almost 50 pages long.
Did you find it funny?
It's sort of funny. Okay. It made me chuckle. There were no belly laughs involved, but there was a wry chuckle here or there. I mean, actually, the only thing I remembered from reading this as a kid is when they dress up the Yeti in human clothes, and one of the characters says like, "Wow, he looks so weird" or something. I remembered that line from when I read this, decades and decades ago. But no, I think that's the thing is that. It's just like not funny enough to be 50 pages long. It needs to be fun. It's like that. I guess that's my thing. It's funny enough to be 25 pages long. It's not funny enough to be 50 pages long, but maybe that I might just have a certain, standard I expect for humor or something.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it's also, and the thing, the humor is like it's not really something you can argue about or debate because it's either you laughed or you didn't. And if you didn't laugh, like nothing I can say will make you have laughed. Right. And so I think that it may also, just be for some readers, including me, it's a very funny story. And for others, it's a moderately funny, overlong story. I will say that in that kind of that same sequence that you're talking about where they find the Yeti. And you're right that, I mean, of course, you know that that they're going to rescue the Yeti, but the question is sort of what are the complications that are going to get in the way of them doing that? Because this seems like a difficult task, and then how are they going to overcome those complications?
But the complications are all basically physical. Like the plane's not going to take off, or like whatever. You know, there's no really character. There's no character complexity related complications.
No, I would say, yeah, I mean, all the characters are very flat, and it's all in this sort of antic style that, like, I enjoyed spending time with the characters, but I wouldn't say any of them felt particularly complex or memorable. But that, I think certainly that sequence when, like, they find the Yeti, they dress him up, they take him down, they run into the Carters, the Yeti speaks for the first time. That whole sequence, I was laughing out loud through the whole thing.
I wasn't. I mean,
I know. Fair enough.
Like when I mean, yeah, that was my, you know, because the Yeti keeps saying namaste or whatever, and I felt like Robinson expected me to think this was like the most hilarious thing I've ever heard, and I was like, it's mildly amusing. So yeah, I don't want to belabor the point, but yeah, I mean, I would definitely give the story if a story about rescuing a Yeti and getting him, you know, extricating him or exfiltrating him from Kathmandu sounds appealing to you in any way, like give it a shot for sure, or, you know, give the story a try for sure. I'm just saying I thought it should have been about half as long as it was. But yeah, I guess I am definitely, I think, more like impatient or, you know, intolerant of excess verbiage, I think, than the average person. So
no, I mean, this is actually something that I find that I do actually argue with a lot of my friends about, particularly with movies, that I've found, especially as I've gotten older, that I'm much less bothered by excessive length. Like, I used to be somebody who, like, 2 out of every 3 movies, I'd be like, that's where you should have ended it. Like, why did you keep going? That there's this whole other, like, you know, 10 minutes to the movie. No. And I think in my old age, I'm now, if there's something I like and I feel like you're doing it well, and there's something interesting that's happening, that economy, I can still recognize it when it's there, but it's not as high on my list of values.
Yeah, it's just the older you get, the more you resemble a Buddhist Yeti, basically.
Yeah, exactly. You know, it's funny though, that's the humor is what we ended up talking about more, because I thought that the other thing that was interesting about it is that, no, from what I understand about Robinson, even though, again, he's somebody who comes from the humanities, there was this New Yorker profile that came out a couple years ago, and they talk about him being sort of like the places he feels most at home. One is, you know, hiking the Sierras, but the other is at scientific conferences. The protagonists are of a lot of his stories are scientists, probably the most common protagonist of his stories. And yet this is a story that sort of inverts that, where, yes, they're scientists, but they're scientists who are trying to hide the discovery. And obviously, I mean, a lot of this is being played for laughs rather than as a serious argument. But it is an interesting contrast with the way science is portrayed, and science and scientists are portrayed in most of the other stories.
Yeah, and I guess I'll say, I mean, you know, like I said, I wasn't crazy about all these stories, but I was really impressed by Robinson's versatility. You know, like I was expecting the stories to all be more in the vein of, you know, like Red Mars or 2312 or something. And as we've said, you know, you've got your like historical black magic stories, you've got your comedic Yeti stories, you got, you know, like just all these, you know, your Philip K. Dick story, your, you know, Greg Egan style story. You know, I mean, he's got a lot more range than I was necessarily expecting going into this. So that is definitely something to note.
Mm-hmm.
All right, so let's get on to our last story in this batch. It's called Remaking History. And so in this story, it's on the moon, and you have these scientists, John and Ivan, and to kill time when they're not doing their scientific experiments, they've taken to filming little movies with their colleagues. And because obviously because the gravity is less on the moon, you know, these don't look like realistic movies set on Earth, but that's all kind of the charm, and these movies have become sort of weirdly popular on Earth, and they do these sort of recreations of historical events. And so in the story in this particular instance, they're recreating an event from their history, which did not occur in our timeline, but in their history, Jimmy Carter's mission to send commandos to rescue the American hostages from the American embassy in Tehran in 1979 succeeded, and there was a popular movie made about it, and so they're kind of like doing their own version of that movie. So Anthony, what did you think of Remaking History?
This is another one of the stories that had maybe that I reacted to the way I reacted to a lot of the stories in this collection, where it was just kind of like, wasn't bad, but it wasn't particularly good. It was, it felt, I would say actually even more negatively than that. I think it's one of the weaker stories in this half.
I thought it was the weakest for sure.
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting idea, but then like it's not developed in any interesting way, and instead there's sort of this kind of adventure plot of the catastrophe, and he's like rescuing people, and like that to me is like the least interesting thing you could do with that setup.
Yeah, so like basically a meteor hits the base and causes decompression, or and John has to he rescues one of his colleagues. So it's sort of like a weird left turn for the story at that point. I thought Robinson's author's note on this was a little funny. He says, quote, "Gregory Benford asked me for a contribution to the series of alternative history anthologies he was editing, and I sent him this." And that's basically all he says. And I thought that there was an implied, hey, it was the best I could come up with on the spur of the moment. An unstated, hey, they can't all be winners kind of sentiment.
Well, there's also this like, I think what I was also hinting at before talking about some of the stories where the sort of more naturalistic element is what interests me rather than the genre element, is that there's sometimes a feeling or a suspicion, which may be fair, may be unfair, that actually the reason the story, in some of these other stories have magic or science fiction in them, or the reason why this story takes place in an alternate history is because that was the market constraint. But actually he could have written a completely other version of that story where there was no alternate history, and it would have been almost identical, and it really wouldn't have mattered at all.
Yeah, I guess another thing was that this story is also pretty short. I think with a number of these stories, there's like so many ideas, or so much like complicated stuff that needs to be explained for the length, that like kind of like by the time you sort out what's going on, it's like, oh, now the story's over. And that was the kind of the case with this. It's like, they're on the moon and they're making movies, but they're making movies about this Tehran thing that didn't happen in our timeline. So like, it takes a little while to get all that straight in your mind, exactly what's going on in this story. And then, it doesn't really pay off. Like the effort you put into to sort all that out doesn't really end up paying off in the end. So yeah, this definitely for me was a story where I don't have a whole lot to say. Oh, I guess it does, to the extent that there is any characterization, it's devoted to the characters debating the great man theory of history. And so this was, written between the lucky strike and a sensitive dependence on initial conditions. So if you liked the latter, I think that this was sort of, maybe a necessary stepping stone for Robinson to get there, or sort of like an early expression of some of the ideas that he was wrestling with in that. But this is pretty disposable to me.
Yeah, I agree that I just think like the discussion of the great man theory in this is just not very interesting either.
And so, I do wonder, given that we're reading the best of Kim Stanley Robinson, I don't understand why a story like this made it in there. I can only imagine that Kim Stanley Robinson has a fairly, small body of short stories. And there wasn't a ton to pick from, and maybe a lot of them were long, so you needed some shorter ones to fit in there. But yeah, I did come away from reading this batch with the idea that Robinson is probably a better novelist than short story writer, and probably has put a lot more time and energy into novels than short stories, and that his short fiction is sort of very much a kind of a sideline, or has not been the primary focus of his creative energies.
I think that's right, and I think that my feeling going into this was that, I think of him as a novelist, but also I knew that I'd read and loved The Lucky Strike, read and liked some other stories, but that reading this reinforces the sense that he is primarily a novelist. And I don't know exactly how long the bibliography of stories is, but I also suspect that it's that there's not that many more volumes of short fiction that you could have made from his bibliography. And I mean, this is also an interesting book in that it's mostly, but not entirely chronological. I mean, in one case, it's, putting sensitive conditions right by The Lucky Strike just makes sense. I think there's a couple other kind of moving things around that I don't fully know why, but maybe it just felt like it flowed better. But I think when you look at the dates, it is mostly like in the 80s. Like he did a lot of writing in the 80s, and then there was some in the 90s, sort of often connected to the longer Mars books. And then it seemed like his energy is really, not that he stopped, but like just the frequency with which he was publishing short fiction, at least judged by the dates of the stories in this book. This book in general, I think, skews a lot more towards the early part of his career.
Mm-hmm. All right, and so no spoilers, Anthony, because once again, you did read these stories in the second half. But so when we come back next time, we'll be talking about The Translator, Glacier, The Lunatics, Zurich, Vinland and Dream, A History of the 20th Century with Illustrations, Muron Shasta, Sexual Dimorphism, Discovering Life, Prometheus Unbound at Last, and The Timpanist of the Berlin Philharmonic, 1942. I know I've never read any of those, know nothing about them, so it will be an interesting experience for me to read those. And I do always just like reading, like the best of short story collections from authors, because I feel like you get this really, sort of broad look at all their interests, and it's actually a really good way to help narrow down which of their novels you might want to focus on. So I think I'll have it'll really be good context if I am ever able to read Aurora or Ministry for the Future, to have read all these stories. I think I'll have a much better understanding of who Kim Stanley Robinson is as an artist that I can bring to those discussions. Anthony, any other final thoughts?
No, not really. Mostly just that. Yeah, I mean, I think both of us felt that there are some surprisingly weak or slight stories for a best of a writer of this stature. But even so, like, I'm glad I read it. I think the best stories in this first half, especially The Lucky Strike, are worth seeking out for anyone. Even if, yes, also you should probably read his novels.
Yeah, and again, The Lucky Strike is available from PM Publishing, and I 100% recommend that. So maybe, give that a look, and if you enjoy it, maybe you'll be interested in some of these other Kim Stanley Robinson stories as well. But we'll be back. But for the moment, we're going to wrap things up there. So we've been speaking with Anthony Ha about the book, The Best of Kim Stanley Robinson. So, Anthony, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you. Talk to you soon.
And that was our interview. So big thanks again to Anthony Ha for joining us on the show. Geek's Guide to the Galaxy is made possible thanks to support from listeners like you. So if you enjoy the show and want it to continue, please support us on Patreon over at patreon.com/geeks or via PayPal over at geeksguideshow.com/crowdfunding. All right, so that was our show. So thanks everyone for listening, and we'll see you next time.